For some reason, it's not even recognizing deinstitutionalization as a word.
Is it spelled correctly?
It won't even like autocorrect.
Huh. The computer's like, what do you mean?
What is this? What is this word?
By the way, I just set the Zoom to record. So, hi, Patreon. We are recording episode 109 on deinstitutionalization of mental health.
Yeah. Shane, otherwise titled, Shane took a crack at notes this time.
Yeah. What did Ryan call us? Shane Braham?
Shane, yeah, we hashtag it Shane Braham.
Shane Braham.
So every time it's just an episode with you and me, it's a Shane Braham episode.
That's our celebrity couple mashup name.
Yeah, it's so good. It's so fun.
Our portmanteau, if you will.
All right. So I just got notice I've got to be out by 2. So we're gonna really dig into this one.
Okay.
I think we should be done by 2, my time.
Yeah, so in an hour it will be 1:45 there.
It's 12:45 now, so in an hour it'll be 1:45.
All right, cool. Perfect. All right, let's go ahead and dive into it. All right. Down 3, 2, 1, go. All right, welcome to Why We Do What We Do. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane. And
we are hosting this show for you. And that's what happened. I introduced it before we said anything. I'm going to stop. Let's scrap that. Let's try that again. That was terrible. Okay.
That was great.
Whoops. All right. 3, 2, 1, go. All right. Take 2. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. This is your host, Abraham.
And this is Shane.
And so I already said it backwards again. We're just going to roll with it. This is your favorite consumable psychology podcast.
Hey, you did it.
I did. I took a crack at it. I just really needed the feeling, I needed the wind under my wings.
That's it. Well, how can you ask somebody to do something if you don't do it yourself? Right?
Exactly. So all of this is to say that let me out of here, Shane. You need to transition me to the real world because I've been here for too long and this place is just not humane.
Yeah, we got to get you out of this really restrictive environment into something less restrictive, right?
We're going to deinstitutionalize me.
Bum, bum, bum.
That was a great intro. That was our best one ever.
Yes, finally. That's it. It only took 109 episodes to get here.
Sweet.
So I have recently discovered that I'm a big history nerd, and I really love the history of our field. And deinstitutionalization is one of those things that I work in both environments where I'll work in a more restrictive environment and work in home and community-based settings. And it's really this particular thing, this whole deinstitutionalization thing, I think is really important for understanding kind of how services have worked and how politics play into this and stuff. And so we're going to kind of dig into this a little bit, but I want to start by saying that there are some political components to this that are related to public policy and some particular presidential administrations. And so what we're going to try and do is just kind of give you that context. We're not going to try and take sides on it as far as that stuff goes. We're going to try to keep it as politically neutral as possible and really discuss kind of what the policy was and how it impacted the United States. Yeah,
absolutely. So darn it, I had something I want to say and I totally lost it. Yeah, all right. Beep. Perfect. Well, let's go ahead and just define it because we've been saying this word deinstitutionalization, which has a lot of syllables, but that's not super clear necessarily what that might mean. And so let's just start by describing the fact that man, that was terrible. Beep. So let's dive into this definition here. Nope, I'm going to try that again. Beep. So deinstitutionalization was this policy of moving those people, those human beings who were deemed mentally ill, which is a importantly way too broad category, from large state institutions and closing facilities, either partially or entirely, sometimes referred to as mental asylums or insane asylums. Okay. And so when you see those old movies that are there are these mental hospitals where there are all these crazy people who are in padded rooms and all of that, that's largely an artifact of the past that doesn't exist very commonly anymore. But that was how mental health was treated. And I don't know if we're going to get into this later, but this included things like, at least initially, women who are considered hysterical because they were upset about something like their husband cheating on them or their child dying or their home falling apart. And
Hmm.
so they were considered hysterical, or they were being beaten. They were being abused. And so they ended up getting locked in these places. Or people who identified as having a sexual preference other than a binary, simply heterosexual, were sometimes locked in here. So this was a fairly broad category of people who ended up in these asylums.
Yes, and I believe Virginia Woolf spent some time in one, if I'm not mistaken, the famous author. So
I did not
um,
know that.
I think so. I want to say that she did, because I think that she was in. I may have this entirely wrong, but it may be because she was considered hysterical.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
So
and I think we should also clarify the term deinstitutionalization, which seems to sort of indicate in its name that we're removing the institutionalization, or removing the institutionalization part of this, which is to say, getting rid of the hospital. It would actually be better talked about as a trans institutionalization, because it wasn't actually just getting them out of hospitals, but moving them to other types of facilities, right?
right, exactly. So you saw this transition from these larger state hospitals to something smaller, like smaller community-based things, and we're going to talk more about that later. But I think what's kind of critical here is talking about why these things were in place initially. We talked about this idea of like housing the mentally ill, quote unquote mentally ill, in these places like mental asylums or insane asylums. And so I think it's probably important to describe what an asylum is, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that historically speaking, to seek asylum is simply to seek shelter. That's it. That's really all that means. Asylum means shelter. And this is historically done by those vulnerable populations that needed help: refugees, people who were fleeing a war zone, people who had been prosecuted and were leaving their country, even people who, as I said, were in those domestically abusive situations and needed help. However, and so that would be seeking asylum. However, this mental asylum, or what is often called an insane asylum, was anything but this sheltered place for them to go where they would be protected against persecution. This was actually kind of an almost systematic form of persecution in a way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's definitely some discussion that's worthy around these places were attempting to treat. There were people in these places that did attempt to treat some of the concerns, but for the most part, it was not. It was not a great place to be.
Yeah, and I guess it is important to say that, as you mentioned, their intentions were good for most of them. And not all of these places were horrible places. More than anything, I think mental health was not well understood. And so the hospitals were not set up in a way to really do very well, and a lot of times helping those people who needed that help.
Right, exactly. So we're going to kind of give a timeline a little bit, but it's important to kind of recognize kind of where these places started. So the oldest mental health hospital was built in 1768, which I think it kind of gives you a picture of how much rich history is built into this particular topic.
It's
And the first
250 years ago.
Yeah, which is not, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, not very long ago. But if you're talking about this particular issue, it's still pretty far away.
Yeah.
And the first patient was actually admitted 5 years later, so they weren't even admitted until 1773.
And I believe that was in the United States specifically.
Yeah.
Now, even as early as the 1840s, people like one person that you could maybe consider a hero of the story, her name was Dorothy Dix, and Dix. And people like Dorothy were appalled by the state of these so-called mental asylums, at least in the ones that she had visited, and she was really advocating for and lobbied for reforms to those institutions. However, deinstitutionalization didn't really begin until nearly 100 years later, during the civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century.
Right, and so the timing of this seemed to imply that deinstitutionalization was because of these places being poorly upkept, that there were civil rights issues and kind of all these things. But there were multiple reasons why they started moving towards this. One was because they let me make sure I read this right, because this is one of your notes.
Yeah.
Okay, so first one was save money. Finally, is hope new antipsychotic drugs. Okay, so those are the two. What's the third one? So the first one was the civil rights stuff.
Was because um,
Because
the
the poor
first one
upkeep.
was, there was the poor quality
Okay.
of life.
Okay. Beep. So of the three reasons, the first one was definitely there was a poor quality of life in these places. In a lot of the places, you shouldn't say every one of them because there were some that were okay. Still understanding that people didn't really understand mental health. They did their best with what they had. So a lot of the places were poorly upkept, but they also needed to save money. These places were pretty expensive to run because you're talking about round-the-clock medical care. You're talking about staff. You're talking about the potential for people getting injured for when you are working with those more dangerous people, right? And then the third part was they were actually trying to introduce a new antipsychotic medication that would help negate the need for the hospitals.
Yeah, absolutely. That it's part of understanding the context for this and why it wasn't, Dorothy was advocating for this, Dorothy Dix, in the mid 1800s, and change didn't come about until the 1900s. And part of the reason for that was because they're like, well, what are we supposed to do? We have nothing else for these people. All we got is like ice picks and electricity and we got to keep them off the street somehow. So,
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Right. But as soon as pharmaceuticals started being developed that were designed specifically, and designed is the important caveat here. I'm not saying that they're working the way they're supposed to be working, but they were designed specifically to address mental health issues, had the state and federal government looking at this going like, hey, like, let's wash our hands of this expense and like get those people out of there. Now, again, there was sort of those three main pillars of why this was able to take place. But that third one really helped to be that linchpin in like, now we have what we need to justify closing these because they're not necessary anymore.
Right. And we're going to actually hit on that particular issue when we get into the timeline, because that's part of the first wave of the entire deinstitutionalization system or policy. So let's dig into that. Let's go ahead and look at this timeline from start to finish of how this policy came about and kind of where it ended up. Okay, so the first thing was that we've kind of mentioned this before. There were a lot of criticisms about state-run hospitals and mental health facilities. They weren't doing really well. They weren't really upkept. People weren't really having a great quality of life, and they were incredibly restrictive. People were they were locked away, and they were locked away for good almost. It was almost like this really, like almost people would voluntarily check themselves in and then never get out.
Yeah, it was like a prison sentence where you weren't actually sentenced, and it was under the guise of we're locking you up to help you sort of thing.
Yeah. So at the time that they started moving on this deinstitutionalization policy, JFK's administration actually created a joint commission on mental health, which is pretty cool that they actually started looking at this. They put together this committee to start looking at mental health concerns. And he had expressed a specific interest in this area because his sister Rosemary had had a lobotomy when she was 23, per her father's request.
Right. And at that time, lobotomies were being seen as like the most cutting edge technology for dealing with mental health, is sticking that ice pick up into their brain and scrambling their brain around, scrambling their neurons. And for some people, there were small effects, but for Rosemary Kennedy, it actually left her in a nearly vegetative state and really radically changed her life.
Yeah, so it would make sense that this is probably a topic that's near and dear to his heart, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. So the ultimate goal was to move from a larger state facility to more community-based care, which I think is a noble goal, right? We should be included. It's you talk about inclusion, you talk about all that, and it was a model scene that we actually kind of see in practice today. You see a lot of community-based care. As somebody who works in community-based care, that's really all I've ever known as far as my practice.
And you can correct me if you're wrong, but isn't part of the idea of that is to help them be more independent, the people who are in those systems, so that they have the dignity of having a life that they have some amount of autonomy and control over, right?
Absolutely. That's the goal is that that if you're working in a community-based setting, the goal is so that somebody doesn't need those services for the rest of their lives. So state hospitals didn't have that.
Right. And so this shift that was taking place to that community-based care model moved the funding from what was being provided at the state level to being responsible at the federal level, so by the federal government.
Yeah. So if somebody's more independent, then they need less resources. And if they need less resources, then it's less costly to taxpayers and to the state and to the government and all that stuff. So ultimately, it's win-win for everybody. You've got people who are deemed mentally ill, who are becoming more independent. You've got state-funded programs that aren't going to be as costly. Like, it sounds good, right? On the surface, it sounds good. And people are going to get care.
And so they sit down with this and they're like, okay, what steps do I need to take? Well, the two main components here are that we need to get people moved out of those facilities. And the second one is to actually close down those facilities and, wrap it up so that they can start using them to film horror movies in.
Or do ghost tours.
or do ghost tours, exactly.
so that's exactly what happened. So they had to figure out how to get people out of the community, out of the facility. So one of the first things that happened was that people who were diagnosed after the policy was implemented couldn't go into these facilities. They were one of the first groups that never even contacted state facilities. They were immediately going into community-based care. So that was one thing that kind of like was really cool about it, is they didn't continue to put people into these programs after the policy was implemented if they were diagnosed later.
Perfect. Yeah. And then there was some waves of activity that took place to facilitate this moving out of the facilities. And the first wave really began in 1955 when the pharmaceutical drug Thorazine was introduced as a sort of chemical restraint for treating those with mental illness. And this was the first antipsychotic medication that was accepted as being an effective treatment for those mental illnesses. But as I understand it, was largely to sort of, I guess, knock people out in a way of just sort of like, let's get you as doped up and loopy as possible so that you are just kind of sort of sit there and drool on yourself. And you won't be able to do anything. And so it's like locking you in a padded room where there aren't any walls because you just can't move or do anything to yourself.
Yeah, if you ever see One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is a
good example.
Which is one of my favorite examples of all this. If you go in and you look at that, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, when Jack Nicholson has a lobotomy and he comes stumbling and drooling on himself, there's something called the Thorazine shuffle that is, which is it looks similar. You're pretty much, what the description is, I've always said, is like you're kind of snowed, like you're very like everything is a haze, like you don't really have control of all of your faculties and you just kind of shuffle your feet. And I've heard the same term for Haldol too. When somebody is pretty much over medicated, that was one of the big side effects that came out of Thorazine. And so people had a really hard time with that later. Like at this time, they were like, it's good. This person's no longer having psychotic episodes. We can release them with this drug. And it wasn't really helping them.
Yeah, I mean, it did have the appearance of having them just watched a Transformers movie where they walk around drooling and tripping all over themselves and confused about the world. But but it also did look like, well, we can give these people this drug and they're sedated, they're not agitated, they seem like they are very mellow, and therefore this is a safe way to transition them out of these hospitals. That was at least the working hypothesis or conclusion with that. As that step.
Right. So it was a quick fix, a Band-Aid issue, right? So that's pretty much what it came down to. So they introduced this drug, they start getting some stuff under control. And then the second wave is that they began to close state mental hospitals and move individuals to, quote, less restrictive environments. And so what that meant was that they were moving individuals sometimes into the community. And that could have been a group home, that could have been a smaller location, that could have been any number of things, but they were moving, or it could have been nothing at all, really depending on the individuals. So they started moving people out of these state mental hospitals as they were closing them.
And as most teenagers can attest, just because you are living not necessarily in a locked room, if you're under the rule of someone else who's telling you what you can and can't do with your life, this in practice may not have really been that much less restrictive. They weren't necessarily in a behind 4-inch thick steel door that locked every night with a tiny 2x2-inch window on it, but they were in something that was slightly bigger and looked a little bit more like a bedroom, which, was probably a little less daunting feeling, but not really that much more free.
Right. And so you had these, or you have people that when they came out of this place that they had a roof over their head or a meal every day, they would go into a situation where they had nowhere to go. They hadn't had jobs for years. They had no family to support them, and they did not have any really good transition plans. And that's kind of Thorazine was the big start of some of the problems that came along with this. But when they started transitioning people out and they didn't have a place to go, that was the second biggest issue that came out of this. Or I would say the biggest issue that came out, but it really one that they didn't anticipate really well.
Yeah. And so how many people were affected by this?
So at the time when they implemented this policy, 560,000 patients were being held in psychiatric facilities. So that's half a million people. 500,000 people were in these facilities at this time. So their plan was to move 500,000 people out of these facilities, or at least close to that, and into some kind of community-based care. Now, in 1994, the current stats, and this was some of the stats that we found. In 1994, and this is still pretty current, about 71,000 people are still in these types of facilities. So the facilities still exist, but there's only about 71,000 people that actually go to these places. And what you saw in at the same time was that we're talking about going from 560,000 patients to 71,000. At the time institutionalization was going on, in 1955, the nation's population was about 160 million. So you're talking about 560,000 out of 160 million, which is still quite a bit.
Yeah, it's a significant proportion for sure.
Yeah.
And that was in 1994, you said?
No, so in 1994, our population was 260 million.
Oh, almost double.
So almost double.
I guess 100 million more, not necessarily
100 million more.
double.
Yeah. So we had 100 million more people and only 71,000 people, about 71,000 people in these facilities. So they did move a lot of people out, right? So the data suggests that they got people out of those facilities, which is probably pretty good. However,
yeah, that was part of the goal, at least.
That was part of the goal. So part of this, despite that, there are bigger issues. So the process actually varied from state to state. So we talked about this first wave and second wave, right? So you had first wave, the Thorazine comes around. Second wave, they start closing the hospitals. Every state kind of did this differently, implemented this stepwise or in different ways. But some states had a 95% success rate of moving groups. So you had Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, West Virginia, Arkansas, Wisconsin, and California were all pretty successful in getting people out of these facilities.
So if you were in Rhode Island, you were one of the maybe quote unquote luckier ones in that you were likely to get out of the hospital, but you cross over that state border into what's next to Rhode Island? Delaware? Is it Delaware? Okay.
We're scientists. We're not geography experts.
We're make up the geography of the United States, which we live in and should know a lot better than we currently do. But let's say you cross over the border of Rhode Island to Delaware, or let's just make if we're gonna go crazy, may as well. You cross over the border from Rhode Island to Alaska, and which means nothing to our international listeners, but Alaska is thousands of miles away, and you're not going to be so lucky getting out of that hospital.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're in Rhode Island, 98% of the people were out of there. But at the end of the day, that was the kind of like the finite number. They weren't talking about transition care. They were talking about coordination of care. They were talking about getting people out of these places. So based on the policy, it was successful, right? They got a lot of people out.
Yeah, I mean, the goal was to move to a less restrictive setting for those individuals with what might be called a mental health disorder, or for whatever reason they had been put in there. And the Commission on Mental Health took the stance that deinstitutionalization focused on the quote, unquote, the objective of maintaining the greatest degree of freedom, self-determination, autonomy, dignity, and integrity of body, mind, and spirit for the individual while he or she participates in treatment or receives services, end quote. And spoiler alert, that is not really how this went.
Right. So that's exactly it. So now we're going to talk about some of the populations that this impacted and a particular schools, kind of so that you can get a picture of this. And then we're going to talk about why this became a problem. So we're not going to spoil it right now. We're going to leave you in suspense, but we're going to get into some of the stuff that kind of came up out of this.
Okay. So as I understand it, between 50 and 60% of people who ended up in mental health hospitals were there because they really enjoyed watching Pretty Little Liars. So understandable that they ended up there, but I'm just kidding. About 50, that's a lot of pop culture references I've been dropping in this episode.
Yeah,
I need to scale it back a little
today.
bit. Anyway, about 50 to 60% of them were diagnosed with schizophrenia. Another 10 to 15% of them were diagnosed with what was called at the time manic depressive illness, which would probably be called bipolar today, mostly because that's the exact same thing, but the name changed. And that, which might be called bipolar today, which is the same thing, but the name changed, or they would be diagnosed with severe depression.
Yeah. And another 10 to 15% were diagnosed with actual organic brain diseases, things like epilepsy, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, and brain damage secondary to trauma, or TBI. So they're contacting a lot of different, you see these facilities are contacting a lot of different mental health concerns. It's not just somebody who is having auditory hallucinations and hearing God speak to them through their TV. It's that might be a very small percentage of that, even that schizophrenia population. But you're talking about some pretty significant challenges that have to do with brain damage and mental illness and neurology and all that stuff.
Is this whole thing a direct quote, or is it just this last sentence here?
I think just the last sentence.
Okay.
So do you okay, let's see.
Sorry, I was just reading through real quick.
No, you're good. Do you want to take that next sentence, or do you want me to?
Sure. Hold on, third minute. Oh, beep. So the remaining percentage of that population were those that had other diagnoses, such as autism, alcoholism, drug addiction, that was concurrent with brain damage, mental retardation, and other types of disorders like that. So that was sort of the remaining percentage of that population.
Right. So you can see it was kind of a catch-all. Like these places were a catch-all.
Yeah. And I mean, mental health and mental illness, as we mentioned before, we did not know nearly as much about those things at that time as we do now. And if you look back at like 1955, I mean, we barely had a diagnostic system at all in place. I mean, it was things like you'd see a doctor who's like, yep, they're crazy. And like, that was about the extent of it. There were very few well-researched diagnostic processes for mental health disorders. You had slightly better ones for those organic brain diseases because they were very observable, but a way of otherwise classifying these experiences of mental health disorders was just it was lacking, to say the least.
Yeah, and I mean, if you consider the timeline and consider just the field of psychology in general, the field of psychology at this time is still a fairly new field. And you're talking about 1955. This is a place of practice that is less than 100 years old. You know, probably closer to 50 years old or so around this time.
Yeah, yeah.
know?
When good mental health treatment started to become available. So, Shane, you have this landmark case of an example of what happened with this this deinstitutionalization or transinstitutionalization process.
Yeah. So a lot of what gets referenced in relation to deinstitutionalization, and kind of one of the catalysts for why it was so important at this time, was there was this school in upstate New York called Willowbrook State School. This is actually a pretty well-known school, and one that was a facility that housed a lot of patients. So this was
more than 6,000, right?
Yeah, it's 6,000 patients, and most of them had some kind of intellectual disability. So which is, I've worked in group homes with like 6 individuals with an intellectual disability. I could not imagine how difficult this would have been.
1,000 times more than that.
Yes, easily. Right. And so
this is one of those places, as I understand it, that if you were to walk through the doors in this place, it would be pretty revolting. You'd look around and see what appeared to be people just living in their own filth. It just, like a garbage heap that was that was poorly maintained. It had a horrible reputation while it was open, and you just walked in there and look around thinking, how does anybody let anybody live like this?
Right. And this was actually, and there were some other, it was even worse than that. Right. So the place was not kept well. People were living in filth. The patients that were there were not cared for, which is just so sad. But something that happened pretty regularly is that there would be hepatitis A outbreaks, which is wild to me. So there were hepatitis A outbreaks, and there was one report that indicated 90% of the patients at the site had contracted it.
his children. Oh, it's because it was a school. That's right.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right. Sorry. Beep. Yeah, and studies were conducted at the site to observe the impact of hepatitis A and evaluate treatment for the virus. So you got these unwilling participants. These studies by Sam Krugman and Robert McCollum were deemed, as you might imagine, ethically dubious, and I think that's putting it very nicely, by expert vaccinologists at the time. So this is taking a vulnerable population that can't advocate for themselves, stuck in what amounts to a prison, and these are kids, and giving them hepatitis or letting them have hepatitis, or otherwise creating a situation where they're just going to get it because it's so filthy, and then watching what happens to them. I mean, this is sort of like Tuskegee all over again.
I was just gonna say exactly it. I mean, it's just this just dark times in psychology. So that's why I like to talk about it, is because we need to know what our history is, because this was problematic.
Yeah. What's the quote? I think it was from Winston Churchill. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to report it or repeat it. Beep. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
Yep, absolutely. So know where you came from. So when people cite psychology as being problematic, you can go back and be like, yeah, it was, but there's some benefit too. There's probably more benefit than harm.
Yeah. Now, eventually, Willowbrook was Eventually, Willowbrook was closed as a result of a major class action lawsuit that was brought against the facility, and it was specifically because, as you might imagine, the inhumane and unhygienic living conditions. And it finally closed its doors for good in 1987, shortly after the second Ghostbusters movie.
So, which is still a great movie, by the way.
Actually, I'm not sure if that came out in 87. I don't remember what year it came out. I'm going to guess that's when it came out, though, and just say that I'm right.
Yeah, no. That's the one with the slime. It's good.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, so you can see why why we'd want you can see why we would want to take these facilities and shut them down, because it seems more harm was being done than good, right? Overall.
Yeah. However, I mean, this does create kind of a conundrum. As we said, you sort of need a two-prong approach here. And while the two steps were like, let's transition people out and close the facilities, you also have to have the step of where do you transition them to? So where do they go once they leave the hospitals? And we did mention some of those like group homes and assisted communities and whatnot, but there was no transition of care or follow-up following those individuals being discharged from their facilities. So essentially those who had lived in those facilities for years were sort of just put out in the world, would end up in a place where someone might make sure they're alive, but otherwise didn't receive any additional support or any additional treatment for their whatever they were suffering with.
Right. And so what ended up happening is that some would benefit from the change. There were people that shouldn't have been in these facilities, right? We can recognize that. There were people that just had a hard time, that just need a little bit of support, and got out of these facilities and went on to have pretty rich lives. But the majority that were released ended up in a lot of different places. So you found that the homeless population increased quite a bit during this time, because a lot of the individuals that were in these places did not have an adequate place to go. There was no transition of care. They were living on the streets. They were in the care of their loved ones who were not equipped to address their mental health needs. So you had people that had put these individuals into a facility, and now they're back in their care. So now they're having to figure out how to care for somebody with these mental health needs that they weren't prepared for, or they ended up in prisons.
And I've heard some verifiable accounts that there were some states that when to transition those people out, they would literally just ship them across the border to another state, drop them off at a bus stop and say, see ya, good luck. And, and yeah, as you said, like this is where a huge proportion of that homeless population came from, is people who were taken from the only home that they have because they were locked away in this prison, dumped on the street where they didn't have a home. And many of them had severely debilitating mental health issues. And that was it. And then people have the gall to look at those people on the street and be like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you pick yourself up and go get a job, you bum? And they're just like, I need help.
Yeah. And it's like, I literally can't do this. I don't have the skills. You know, I worked with a woman who had been institutionalized from the time that she was a toddler until they had deinstitutionalized a lot of state hospitals in Ohio. Yeah. And when I started working with her, she had been in group homes, but she had never learned any skills. Nobody had taught her anything, and she had tardive dyskinesia. So she was having side effects from all the medication that she had been on for all these years as a result of this particular population, or this particular policy, I should say.
You bumped the mic for a second. Will you just say the side effects of the medication she'd been on again?
Say what?
It was the part where you were saying the side effects of the medication she'd been on, and you bumped your mic. So if you could just say the part again, I can cut it in.
Okay. Beep. So she had all these side effects of these medications that like the tardive dyskinesia related to that. She had all these tremors. She was shaking. She had this really hard time, and it just was a shame to see that somebody was so impacted by this policy for so long. I mean, I worked with her 10 years ago. 10 years ago, and we're still seeing the impacts of this.
Man. Yeah, and I mean, just looking at this, the overall process of transitioning people out of that restrictive environment to a less restrictive one, this could have worked. This could have been if they'd had a plan in place, if they'd had a place for them to go, if they'd thought about how are we going to address this once they're out of there, rather than let's drug them up, slap them on the butt, throw them off the bus, and say like, have fun. There's the whole world for you. Now you're free. Good job.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that it was carried out, the way that it has been approached historically, it looks like it couldn't work. And actually, there is an interesting quote here that goes, quote, "Deinstitutionalization doesn't work. We just switched places. Instead of being in hospitals, the people are in jail. The whole system is topsy-turvy, and the last person served is the mentally ill person," end quote. And this was from a jail official in Ohio.
Yeah, and so what you saw was that we kind of talked about the homeless population expanding and growing because of this and all that, but there was a boom in the prison systems as a result of this. And so there's a couple different examples that we're going to go over. So, for example, George Wooten was jailed multiple times in the Denver County Jail in May of 1984. And you saw this kind of pop up a lot around this population. He was a 32-year-old man. He'd been jailed over 100 times, including 28 times in the previous 2 years. So, and just for creating disturbances in the community. Now, what's important about this situation is that he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia at 17, and each time he used alcohol or sniffed glue or paint fumes, it made the symptoms worse. And so then he would start, so not only did he have schizophrenia, but now he had addiction issues, and none of this was being treated. So instead of being treated, he was getting arrested multiple times.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about, this is someone who has struggled with this probably their whole life, only diagnosed at 17, doesn't mean he wasn't suffering from it before, never learned appropriate skills for deal with this, and found some amount of relief in self-medication in the form of mind-altering substances, and probably was jabbed with Thorazine a couple of times, and had no way of navigating his world in a meaningful way. And the only solution that people approach this with was like, let's get him off the streets, throw him in jail. And I mean, I can't even begin to imagine how costly that was to all the taxpayers to, like, rather than address this and get this person some help, let's keep jailing them over and over and over again. Like, that's a terrible idea. What a poor way of managing this.
Right. And it didn't get any better. Like that was part of the problem. Like it didn't fix what was happening with this guy. It didn't serve him any purpose other than he was being jailed again and again and again.
And to your point, so between 1980 and 1995, so just this 15-year span, the total number of those individuals who are incarcerated in American jails while this deinstitutionalization was going on increased from 501,886, so over 500,000 people, to 1.5 million people, or specifically 1,587,791. So very closely, almost 1.6 million people. So this is an increase of 216% from the incarcerated people. And of course, not all of those are going to be people who had some kind of mental health diagnosis, but they did provide a substantial number of people who basically just went from one set of locked doors to another set of locked doors. And again, at tremendous expense to the government.
Yeah. And ultimately more restrictive, right? So we talked about the state facilities not being nearly as restrictive, not being behind iron bars, but now you're talking about somebody who is jailed in a cell. Yeah. And in a population of people that are not diagnosed with a mental illness. And you have this powder keg of issues that goes on there.
Yeah. And they were likely to be, there's something I don't know if we've talked about before, but people who have mental health disorders are far more likely to be the victims and to be victimized by other people than they are to be perpetrators of some type of crime. So they end up in these places probably mostly because people are scared of them and don't know how to manage their behavior, which seems unpredictable and different from what they're used to. And then they end up in this place where they're likely to be beaten, to be abused, to be mistreated. And again, they don't even know what's going on some of the time.
Absolutely. And so, besides kind of seeing that there's an increase in people being incarcerated, you also saw this increase in mercy bookings. And people talk about this, but they don't really understand a lot of what it is or didn't know that it had a formal title. So what mercy bookings are essentially somebody commits a petty crime so they can stay in a warm place with food and shelter. Homeless shelters are being filled with people and there's no care for that. They're being kicked out of their facilities. There's no care for them in those hospitals anymore. So this was the easiest way to get food and shelter. So not only do you see people committing more egregious crimes, you saw people committing petty crimes just to get a meal.
Yeah, I mean, you just got to think about these poor people who were probably thrown in these hospitals, stayed there for decades, never developed any skills. They probably their brains sort of rotted away while they were in these understimulating environments. Then they're drugged up, thrown on the street, and now they're homeless, and they're just like, to get any sort of respite, their best option is to commit some kind of crime so that when they end up in jail, they are at least in a place where there's shelter and they're protected from the elements. It's probably warm, and they get some amount of the state's required to provide provision so that they don't starve to death while they're there, which of course is necessary because otherwise it would just be a death sentence. And I mean, yeah, like that becomes their best option. And it's one of those things where that's why they do those things. That's why people will sometimes do these criminal activities, is because that's their best choice at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to kind of further elaborate on that point, John Belcher had done a study with 132 patients that were discharged from a Columbus State hospital. And so what they did was in 1985, they started studying these patients at 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months to see what happened after their transition. And by the end of 6 months, 17% of that 132 had been arrested. So you saw even in a small group, they were being arrested. Now, 65 of those 132 had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, manic depressive illness, or severe depression. And 21 of them had been arrested and jailed. But there's not a lot of data on what other diagnoses were there. But ultimately, what you see is 132 people were discharged, and many of them got arrested following that discharge.
Yeah, it's sort of this hospital to jail pipeline of like, well, we're just going to shuffle you from this cage to this cage, and and just these poor people again, like they don't have an option, they don't have a choice, they don't have anything that they can do to better their situation, and they also have almost nobody who's advocating for them.
Yeah, and so you see that. At the end of the day, this became a bigger problem than people were prepared for. I think that the intention was good, and they just did not have the systems in place to make it happen in the way that it should have. And that's ultimately why you see these horrifying stats. So, but we do have some good news. So it's not all doom and gloom. Things have gotten a little better.
Yay.
So we wanted to provide a little bit of current information. So now we've talked about deinstitutionalization as a policy and kind of seeing what the effects were, but seeing kind of the remedies that are coming up. So in 2010, the Affordable Health Care Act had mandated that insurance companies must cover mental health care as one of the 10 essential benefits. So now people are having more access to mental health treatment, including alcohol, drug, and other substance abuse and addiction issues. So people are taking it more seriously. Now that was as recent as 2010.
Yeah, and I mean, in 2013, there was an article that reported that almost 7% of the population would be diagnosed as having a severe mental illness, and that's 7%. I mean, while that doesn't sound like a huge percent, that is a ton of people who would have that diagnosis. And if all of those people were locked up, we're looking at a major shift in how our government would have to handle those things, both state and federal governments.
Yeah, especially if you're talking about close to 300 million people, 7% of that population is a big deal.
Yeah, to give you, I guess, a frame of reference, what I've been hearing recently, I like to listen to podcasts that'll report on some of the things like the economy, and where if you see something as small as 0.5%, that will bloom an entire industry around catering to the demand created by a 0.5% of the population. So 7% is an
14
enormous,
times that.
That's 14 times that. Yeah, that's an enormous amount, and a lot that affects a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that kind of came out of this too is that many states started focusing on a least restrictive environment type of policy. So they started looking at creating services or rendering services in home or community-based settings before even considering restrictive placements. So what this means is if I work in a family home and I'm providing services and this person needs a higher level of care, they don't immediately go to some kind of lockdown facility. They might go to somewhere that's a little bit more restrictive, that can provide a different level of support than can be offered in that setting. So what they try to do is they try to move backwards. They try to, or backwards is probably not the appropriate term. They try to move into a more restrictive if they can or if they need to, but they only go as restrictive as is necessary to better support that person.
It does seem to be that, at least over the last maybe 20 years or so, the goal really has been, let's support this population in helping them be more independent and have that dignity. And even though, like, there's always going to be a question of dollars and cents as a bottom line to the people who are cutting the checks and making the decisions about policies around this, when there is that compassionate angle, it does end up actually saving money. Like, when we approach this in terms of how can we help these people have a more independent, more fulfilling, more socially engaged life, then it ends up costing us less money to fund that approach, because they don't end up in the prison system. They don't end up causing a bunch of, committing a bunch of crimes. They don't end up having to go to these subsidized shelters because they can take care of themselves. So, like, it would cost so much less to just support that population than to just try and ignore them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I was trying to pull up a stat because I wanted to compare. I wanted to make a note real quick. Let me pull this up.
Perfect. I actually had a segue in the next point I wanted to make anyway.
Yes,
so
do it. Do it.
Beep. So one thing that occurred to me as we were talking about this, and as I did my research, is this did seem to be more or less American focused. And that was partially, when I was preparing my notes on this, was that we were talking about deinstitutionalization as it took place in the United States. But what's interesting is that there are reports that this is not just an American movement, that other countries too have taken on this approach of how to deal differently with how they have treated mental health. Obviously, not every single country locked them up in a prison system to begin with, but for those countries that did take that approach of, what do we do with these people? Let's put them in a quote unquote hospital, where they will be interred for some indefinite period of time. Around the globe, you saw reductions in hospital settings. So in Australia, China, South America, Africa, these were all places where that there was a big push to try and reduce the I'm going to call them incarcerated individuals who had mental health problems, and that's why they were being incarcerated. In Uganda right now, there's only one of these hospitals left.
It's pretty cool. So it was cool to see that, like, around the same time this movement was happening. So it wasn't just that they're happening in stages or that you see like kind of this ripple effect. You saw this happening at the same time. So that was really neat. Now, as far as current reports go, and this is as soon as 2014, it seems to indicate that 71,000 number is still pretty accurate. That's still about where that number hovers. But we actually were able to reduce the number of state hospitals in the United States from 322 active state-funded, federally funded hospitals to down to 188. So I think that's a pretty significant decrease, considering that we're talking about shutting down most of these facilities at some point.
Yeah, and I mean, there are still around, and often they do still provide a valuable service to some people. And as I said, once we transitioned away from, like, we're just going to drug people up, or we're just going to lobotomize them, or we're just going to shock their brains, which I want to make sure I indicate, like, there is some research to support electroconvulsive therapy for some mental health disorders. We got a very impassioned communication from someone who used that, who is like, hey, you guys talked pretty disparagingly of this, but this is actually really helpful. So I want to make sure that we're clear that we're not just saying this is an evil thing, but there are other ways of addressing this, and that these new settings are much more likely to include looking at their behavioral health and developing support around teaching them more independence and better skills, and providing them the resources they need to be successful.
And they're probably more closely monitored than they have ever been. Like, when we're talking about the 50s versus the aughts, we're talking about specifically that there are more policies and procedures in place to protect these vulnerable populations. So on top of the fact that we have moved to a least restrictive environment and more person-centered intervention, we've also moved to protecting those vulnerable individuals from the type of care that they were receiving back in the 40s and 50s.
Cool. Ready to wrap this thing up?
Let's do it. So just some kind of general take-home points. Deinstitutionalization wasn't really a bad idea. It just was implemented poorly. Like,
Yeah,
that's really the core of it. Its ultimate goal was pretty wholesome and pretty important. I think it has made some pretty good impacts, but it was implemented so poorly that it resulted in a bigger issue than people were ready for.
yeah. I mean, it would have been ideal if those people hadn't been locked up in the first place, but knowing that they were already there, the idea of like trying to get them out of those facilities was probably a generally good idea, especially thinking of places like Willowbrook, where and other places, you know, where they were living in squalor and they were not being treated with humanity and with dignity. That this was a perfectly reasonable position to want to take. It just, the way that it was executed lacked the important foresight that would have been necessary to make it a successful and effective a transition. So deinstitutionalization was from looking at this from like a government level, this is a policy, and it essentially included those two sort of waves we talked about of getting them out of the hospitals and then shutting down those hospitals.
Yeah, and so ultimately, we kind of touched on this a little bit. That poor planning and the lack of funding resulted in some bigger issues. Like, you had high recidivism rates, you had a really high issue of jailing and homeless populations that kind of bloomed. So you saw bigger issues that came out of just moving somebody out of a state hospital. I think we probably ended up wasting more money. I don't want to say wasting. We ended up costing more money to the consumers and to the taxpayers and all the people that were involved in this. We ended up causing more issues than good as a result of that poor planning and lack of funding.
I'm going to skip the next point because we already said it.
Yeah.
Another point is that there is strong evidence that increases in that crime may have been specifically related to that policy. And we've talked about that quite a bit. And actually, I think you just mentioned that we sort of just filter them out of these hospitals and right into jails, as sometimes there were those mercy bookings because that was their best option. And sometimes like they just didn't know how to behave outside of the walls of that institution. And so we're like, well, got to lock you up again. And that was just happened to them.
Yep, that's pretty much it. And so ultimately, there's still facilities open that provide treatment for those with more severe symptoms or that might need a higher level of care. They are out there. They are more closely monitored. There's a little bit more science behind what they're doing now too. And I think that those are important things to recognize, but there are still facilities out there, but they're just not as prevalent as they used to be.
Yeah. And we probably don't need to deinstitutionalize a lot of those at this point. Like, there are probably some places where people are still interned that don't need to be or shouldn't be or would be better off in a less restrictive environment, but there are going to be those people who they don't have any family, they don't have anything else, and the best support for them will be something that's more like a hospital. I don't know if we need as many as there are, but maybe we do. It's just unclear. But yeah, that's sort of just where we're at with this topic. I think is that I don't think we would even advocate that everything needs to be shut down, just that we have a very clear process for why are you here? How are we going to take care of you while you're here? What's the plan to transition you to a more independent life? And always to have a goal of what that looks like.
Yeah, the terminal goal should not be to be in a state-funded hospital facility for the rest of somebody's life.
Yeah,
like if that's the end goal, then you're missing the point of human services.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's a good place to end.
Perfect. I feel pretty good about that. Really well done on this, Shane.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I guess if people didn't know, Shane really did the major legwork on the background and research of this episode. So if you enjoyed this one, you can send an email and let Shane know. I'm sure he'd appreciate that.
Yeah, I love feedback. So, and if I did something wrong, tell me too. I'm happy with that.
Yep. Which really leads us to, hey, we love hearing from people. Contact us, email us, tweet to us, post something on Facebook. If you want to talk to me specifically, I monitor our Discord server. Hey, we have all these new Patreon levels that you can join. They have all these cool perks for every level that you join. You get that level and all the perks below that, which includes things like bonus episodes, uncut versions of episodes, videos of us recording. You can talk to us on our Discord server. I also monitor our email and our SoundCloud comments. So those are places you can talk to me directly. Otherwise, Shane, I believe you monitor our Twitter for the most part.
I kind of help monitor our Instagram and some of our Facebook. So I haven't really spent a lot of time on Twitter yet, but that is something that we are going to work on kind of having more of a private presence on as well.
Sweet. Perfect. Yeah. And then you can reach us on a whole bunch of platforms. We're on the smart speakers and TuneIn, Spotify, all the places.
All the fun stuff.
Yep. All right, perfect. Well, I think that's it. Anything else?
Nope, that's it.
All right, thank you for listening. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya. All right.
Sweet. If you wouldn't mind getting those things uploaded.
That one went really smooth.
It did.
Yep, I already uploaded the last one. So
perfect. I was going to recommend we do our bonus episode, but it's already getting fairly late, and you need to get out of there.
yeah, I won't have time to do it today, man. I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. It was I overslept. If I'd gotten here in time, we very likely would have finished this, 30 minutes ago and been able to do a quick little thing. So,
well, I'll be able to. What time is the recording on Tuesday? I could probably do a bonus episode on Tuesday.
In the morning. Let me take a look real quick. That's a great question. I should add that to the actual schedule. Okay. Shit. My Tuesday schedule got all fucked up. If I'm able to do one at all, it would be, I'd have about 30 minutes from 7 to 7:30 my time, which would be 10 to 10:30 your time.
Okay. I might be able to do that. I might be able to do that from my car though. That might be an issue.
Okay.
I'll have to double check that and see. I'll let you know.
Dude, my week is crazy. What the fuck?
Yeah, I just like scheduled out my week, and it's like my right hand is quitting. And so I'm like losing I'm losing my whole hand. No, I'm losing
Jamie Lannister.
Yeah, I'm losing like one of my like best staff, and because he's like getting a full-time job at FIT. So it's like,
oh,
okay, I get it, but so I'm losing him, and then and just then like 3 other people that we're working with are quitting to go work with Brett DeNovi.
Cool. Well, maybe not cool. I mean,
it's fine. We'll figure it out, I guess.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's all right. It'll be okay. We'll get there. So.
All right. Sweet, man.
All right, man.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem, man. I'll see you next week.
Sounds good.
All right. Take care, man.
Bye.
I see ya.